Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Eric Masood, and I work on the professional engagement team at Brake, where we work with fleet operators and suppliers to share resources and best practice across the industry. Before we begin the webinar, a few quick points about the setup and a brief background on Brake for those who are less familiar with our work before handing over to today's speakers. We have representatives from SmartDrive, Loughborough University, and Balfour Beatty, all experts in their field, who will be able to share their knowledge with you. So now you should be able to see my presentation and hear the audio alongside it. As attendees, you're all muted, so you don't need to worry about any background noise from your offices. After each speaker, there will be an opportunity for a Q&A discussion. There are two ways to put forward your question. Firstly, there's a chat box on the webinar panel on the right, where you can send your question at any point during the speaker's presentation, and we'll put that question to them at the end of their session. Alternatively, there's a raise hand icon on the same panel, which you can press during the Q&A, and it will unmute you, and you can put your question to the speaker directly over the phone. Now I'm just going to give you a brief overview of Brake, who we are and what we do, before handing over to the first speaker. So Brake is a national road safety charity that exists to stop the needless deaths and serious injuries that happen on our roads every day, make streets and communities safer for everyone, and care for bereaved families and those injured in road crashes. As a charity, we have four main aims. Brake's vision is quite simply a world that has zero deaths and injuries, and that people can get around in ways that are safe, sustainable, fair, and healthy. Our three main focuses are support, campaigning, and education. So in terms of support, we run a helpline in the UK for people bereaved and seriously injured in road crashes. You can see some information on the support that our helpline provides, and the level of support we gave in 2015 on the screen now. In addition to the helpline, we also provide support literature and work very closely with police forces throughout the UK, so that when someone does receive that knock on the door from a family liaison officer, they are providing them with best practice support literature. We also campaign nationally and regionally to raise awareness amongst the public, but also to lobby government and push for change in road safety legislation. An example of this is our 2016 Road to Justice campaign, which centred around getting justice for bereaved families. The campaign launched outside Parliament and gained a lot of media attention and resulted in the government opening a consultation on criminal driver sentencing. We also do a lot of campaigning more generally on raising awareness of a range of topics, some of which you can see on the screen now. So as you can see, campaigning makes up a lot of what we do, and here are some other ways we do it. And the final side of what we do is awareness raising and education in communities. This is done through projects such as Beep Beep Days. These run with nursery school children aimed at raising awareness and teaching them about road safety at a young age. It's also a great way for some of the corporates we work with to get involved, go out into their local communities and show that they're passionate about road safety and want to help the communities they operate in. The other side of education is that we work with employers of at-work drivers through our Brake Professional Membership Scheme. This global membership scheme was founded in 1996 and aims to share best practice amongst employers. We run an annual calendar of events, including webinars such as today's, and seminars and training throughout the year. We also have annual flagship events such as the Fleet Safety Conference and Fleet Safety Awards. So in terms of upcoming events, we have the Fleet Safety Awards. The entry deadline is actually this Friday, and it's open to anyone and it's free to enter. In addition to these events, we also produce a lot of resources for employers, including guidance reports on introducing policies and share best practice case studies. Alongside that, we provide employers with tools to use directly with their drivers. So you can see on screen some of the posters, infographics and videos you can use to engage your drivers. So on to today's webinar. I'm now going to hand you over to Aidan Roaston from SmartDrive, who is our first speaker. Hi, Aidan.
Hi, Zaria. So do you show the slides or do I have to share my screen to show the slides?
Yeah, do you want to share your slides, your screen?
Okay. I didn't know I had to do that, so my apologies. I thought you were going to show the slides. So can we give me a couple of seconds here to set this up? Apologies about that.
No, sorry, I'm sorry.
So tell me if you can see the full screen.
Yeah, there it is. That's perfect. Thank you.
Not the note slide, the full screen. Is it showing correctly?
No,
Yeah?
just the full screen, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay,
Right.
so good afternoon. I'll crack on then. So thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aidan Rowsome. I'm Vice President EMEA for Smart Drive Systems. So we specialize in video-based driver risk management solutions and programs. We've been active in the UK since 2009, and we have a very well-established customer base of commercial vehicle fleets. For example, if you see the Ocado home delivery fleet, you will see that they have our solution in all of their home delivery fleet, and Turners and so on, Reynolds and some people like that. So what I want to share with you today is the results of a recent study. It highlights key observations that distinguish the most distracted drivers from all the other drivers, and particularly I want to look at what learnings we have about risk associated with mobile phones, particular smartphones. So firstly, I think it's, we need to have a very sobering reminder of the true impact of distracted driving. We know it costs lives. We know it wreaks havoc for families and friends left behind, and not just for the victims, but for the drivers, the instigators as well. They're untold tragedies. It costs fleets and businesses such as yours very, very dearly in many, many different ways. And I think it's important that we recognize some of them, some of the more recent tragedies that we've seen on the roads have involved professional commercial drivers using mobile phones, using smartphones. So it's a very hot topic, it's a very relevant topic, and it's something we need to look at very closely. One of the things that's becoming very clear is that despite all of the safety features in modern vehicles, the drivers are still the most advanced part of the driving experience. We know that vehicles now, commercial vehicles, are engineered to within an inch of their life. They now to try and get any more safety out of them, you're dealing with fractions of percentage improvements. They're incredibly well engineered with all sorts of active safety systems that we all use. But it's really behind the wheel that literally, performance behind the wheel that can make the difference between life and death. And this has a massive impact on your brand, your reputation, your business results across the whole gamut of your business. So drivers are still the most important thing that we need to look at in terms of risk management and safety and distraction. So what I'm going to share with you today is a recent study of what we call our Smart IQ Beach Snapshot. This really is an in-depth analysis and metrics of top fleet performance based on our database of 180 million analyzed and scored risky driving events. And what we've done is we've aggregated and anonymized data from all of our global customers covering a recent 12-month period, and video probably, from the last estimate, over 14 billion driving miles. So there's huge learnings that we can aggregate and show. So the findings of the analysis, we're going to demonstrate that distracted drivers are less safe overall. You might think that's an intuitively obvious thing to show, but I think it's important to get into it in a little more granular detail and define what we mean by distraction and how exactly that impacts on the overall risk. These drivers also show driving errors at a significant higher rate than all other drivers, and especially drivers distracted by mobile phones, you'll see, are the ones that are the most risky. Two of the key observations, just to share with you briefly, are that, and if nothing else, remember these two, that we know near collisions are a strong indicator of risk and are a key contributor to the risk. So distracted drivers are 36% more likely to be involved in a near collision, and this jumps to a staggering 88% for drivers most distracted by mobile phones. And we all know that near collisions are the tip of the iceberg that will ultimately lead to serious collisions. So this is the data we have to show you, and I'm going to dive into it in a little bit more detail just to show you the learnings from this 14.5 billion miles and 180 million driving events that we've analyzed. So what we did was we examined drivers who were involved in at least one collision during a 12-month period, and we compared that to drivers who were not involved in any collisions. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to analyze the extent to which distractions were a factor in the weeks leading up to the collision. So can we say that observations of distracted driving are going to be a leading indicator of those drivers who ultimately have a higher risk of collision? So what you're looking at now are the percentage rates that a driver involved in a collision during the analysis period was more distracted, and what the distraction was compared to drivers that weren't involved in a collision. So if you like, we're starting at a 0 point of taking those drivers who weren't involved in a collision and looked at those drivers who were and said, how much more distracted were they, taking the non-distracted drivers as a baseline. So, I mean, just graphically and just even looking at it without looking at the detail, you'll see a significant higher rate of distraction for those drivers that were ultimately involved in a collision. So, for example, you know, based on the objective video-based evidence that we're collecting, a driver that has been involved in a collision during the 12-month period is on average 94% more likely to be regularly distracted by talking on a handheld phone than one that's not involved in a collision. So now what we're doing is we're actually putting numbers on statistical risk, measured risk, not just intuitively, to say that when you're distracted by a mobile phone, you will get away with it once, you will get away with it twice, but ultimately, you will have a much higher rate. Those drivers will ultimately, over a 12-month period, have a much higher rate of collisions than those not distracted by phones. So, you know, texting behind the wheel, you'll see on the screen, there's a whole bunch of categories of distracted driving. Obviously, mobile phone, talking handheld, is the highest, one at nearly 94%. Mobile phone talking hands-free still shows a 40% more observation for those drivers who ultimately have a collision. Mobile phone texting, obviously, other tasks, talking to passengers, smoking, eating food, drinking. All of these things take drivers' attention away from the road. And now we're, for the first time, statistically proving the increased level of risk that those drivers bring to your business. So the challenge for us as people interested in fleet safety is, how do we identify those drivers that exhibit these risky behaviors? How do we identify them regularly, successfully, efficiently, and effectively? And how do we coach out of them the fact, or not coach out of them, basically coach them into understanding that they're substantially increasing their risk? And that's the challenge. There are other findings from the study that I think are important. So drivers involved in near collisions are much more likely to have actual collisions in the future. Again, you might think that's intuitively obvious, but you can see here again with the first box that the most distracted drivers are 36% more likely to be involved in a near collision. And as we said before, 88%, it rises to 88% for a mobile phone. So we know that distracted driving causes near collisions, which ultimately will lead to a collision. Distracted drivers also speed. We've found that distracted drivers will typically speed 10 miles an hour or more over the speed limit, again, as a result of the distraction that they're experiencing. Other data shows that lane control is also affected by distracted driving. Again, you might think this is intuitively obvious, but we can show from our observations that distracted drivers drift out of lane 91% more than other drivers. We're now putting numbers on what we intuitively know to be true. And drivers who most often use mobile phones drift nearly 2.5 times more than all other drivers. And finally, distracted drivers don't wear seatbelts. They typically, they're 6 times more likely not to wear a seatbelt, which again is adding to a significant risk, as well as obviously being illegal. So it's not just as important for safety. We also need to look at distracted driving and how it affects the operational efficiency of your business. So miles per gallon for distracted drivers is over 6% lower than all other drivers. And if you take the specific case of those drivers using mobile phones, miles per gallon is over 8% lower than other drivers. And that's only one effect of the operational efficiency. You know, there's cost of downtime, the cost of repairs, late deliveries or affected services, reputational damage to your brand and general business reputation. All of these things are incredibly costly and damaging to your business. But the starting point of most of these is distracted driving. And if you can coach and recognize distracted driving, you will reduce all of these risks and you will reduce the downstream effect of safety and operational efficiency impacts on your business. So, you know, how do we define distracted driving? So our evidence, based on over 180 billion risky events, clearly shows that tackling driving distractions will improve safety in your commercial fleet. We found that there are 9 simple steps in your corporate governance and driving training that will make a difference. I'm going to very briefly go through them on the next slide before I finish. But they may seem obvious, but you know, look at them very carefully and say, do you recognize these things in your fleet? If we're honest, we'll all see things that we recognize, and it's important that we recognize them and address them and applying them to yourself, and also taking them back and applying them to your fleet. So, you know, focus on driving. Do we? Emergencies. Do we use our mobile phone for emergency situations only when you're driving? Do we pull over? Drowsy driving. If you're drowsy, do you pull off the road? Drowsiness increases the risk of a crash by nearly 4 times. Multitasking, a classic distraction of drivers, trying to do too many things. Are our drivers focusing on the road and the drivers around us? Are we getting everything settled before we start driving? Storage. Is your cab clean? Are there gear and lunch and things moving around distracting you in the vehicle? Do we make adjustments before we actually start? Our GPS, our seats, our mirrors, our climate control, sound systems. The amount of events we see where drivers are actually working with GPS systems and working with radio is just excessive, and it needs to be addressed. Finish dressing and grooming on the road. A huge example. We see a lot of examples of people grooming themselves behind the wheel. Snacking, eating, drinking. Again, seems innocuous, but it's part of distracted driving. Other tasks, general other tasks around the vehicle that we see drivers doing. So the key takeaway, before I hand over for Q&A, the key takeaway for this is that this proves that distracted driving has a real effect on the efficiency and effectiveness and safety of your drivers that will lead to near collisions, that will ultimately lead to collisions, that will ultimately damage your business and impact safety of you and the general public. The takeaway is, how do you find a way to identify those risks, coach them out of your driving fleet before they lead to near collision, before they lead to collision, before they impact your business? That's the takeaway. Happy to help, happy to take questions. So thank you for your attention. That's all I have for you today.
That's great. Thank you, Aidan. So you mentioned that keeping an eye on this behaviour from the early days is the best way to kind of keep on top of it. Obviously, telematics can do so much in terms of monitoring speed and harsh braking. But if it is something like distracted driving, you see you have to have cameras fitted in the cab, and a lot of drivers aren't always as keen on that. So what do you suggest to somewhere that's trying to get video footage installed into their cabs? What do you think is normally the best way to get the drivers to buy in?
So the first thing is, as you said, telematics only tells you an outcome. It tells you harsh braking, accelerating. It doesn't tell you the root cause. It doesn't tell you the driver was on the phone. It doesn't tell you somebody walked out in front of the vehicle. So telematics doesn't help with root cause. Cameras can obviously help with root cause, but 10 hours of video a day is of no value. You need a programmatic approach that will actually find those risky behaviors. And for the driver, you must embrace the drivers right at the very start of the process. You must bring them into the process. You must explain that this is not a disciplinary procedure. This is a training tool for them. This is as much for them to be more safe on the road. You cannot bring this in secretively with the driver. You must, long before a camera hits the vehicle, you must consult with drivers. You must work with them. You must tell them how the system works. You must basically explain that this is for their safety. Explain that you will, as I say, disciplinary is not relevant. This is a training tool. If you bring drivers with you, very quickly, they'll understand that this helps protect them. It exonerates them when they're not at fault, shows them issues that they need to work on, helps them work on those issues. So the answer is bringing drivers into the process right at the very start and consulting and working with them.
That's great. Thank you, Aidan. I'm going to hand over to Steve Reed now from Loughborough Design School.
I'm just going to see if I can get my screen on.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Fantastic. Okay, so what I'm going to do over the next 20 minutes is kind of give a brief run through of kind of the academic perspective of distraction. So a little bit out of the normal topic perhaps people are used to. So give a little bit more about the theoretical kind of background to this, why people get distracted, how distraction occurs, and what the effects maybe are. So for all that, the introduction to me is it's slightly different. So I've been accident investigator, or been working here 15 years, accident investigator for 5 of that. So we saw the effects of distraction a lot when we were going out in our police cars to look at crashes. After that, I moved into running real-world driver trials, so similar to kind of the video stuff that Aidan probably looks at. So actually videoing people in cars and seeing what people do and how people get distracted. So what is distraction? Well, we need to kind of look at a number of different elements, I think, really. I mean, we normally think about visual. It's the most easy to understand. A driver takes their eyes off the road. But there are many more distraction modes, and I think Aidan touched on some of them before, that take the driver's attention away from their primary task. Some of these can be initiated. So a driver makes a conscious decision to engage in a potentially distracting task. They perhaps overestimate their ability to multitask. And other distractions can be unexpected, so a driver may not realise they're distracted until it's too late. Fundamental concept, a cornerstone really of distraction from this academic perspective is attention. Without realising it, we use a number of cognitive functions, remembering, perceiving, automatically and instinctively. We do this normally through our everyday life. Paying attention, certainly within the context of the driving task, is relatively automatic. The level of attention does vary, however, depending on the driving task. So we can see that motorways, potentially lower levels of attention needed, conditional based, and urban, perhaps higher attention levels. A good way of looking at this attention is to consider what we work on as the Wickens model. And this proposes that we have a limited attentional capacity. We can use this capacity how we want, but we can't exceed it. So my little diagram there shows a kind of notional attentional capacity, and within that we have a task we're trying to do. We can liken this attention capacity to a computer. So a computer only has limited processing capacity, and if we ask too much of it at any time, we risk a crash. So if I add a few more things to my diagram to kind of give an idea of what might happen in the real world, if we add more, we risk putting pressure on our attentional capacity. So in the example now, we've got our normal driving task, which stays the same. Perhaps this time we're talking on a phone, and we're trying to understand the satellite navigation system. And when we see this attentional capacity, see we're putting pressure on that, we can initiate mistakes. And what we can say for certainty pretty much is that nobody actively wants to makes mistakes on purpose. No, it wouldn't be mistakes otherwise. So the fact that they are mistakes indicates that the cause of distractions can be unexpected. So we might not know that all those things are, perhaps with the exception of talking on a phone, it's a bad example there, but we might not know that we're nearing the limits of our human ability until something goes wrong. So I can kind of demonstrate this with this sort of table affair here. So if we now consider how different elements combine, so we're not just talking, the previous slide kind of looked at attention as an amorphous sort of blob, really, but actually we can get distracted in a number of different senses. So as I previously mentioned, visual is probably the most widely recognized, but we also need to consider the mental, so cognitive distraction, and manual tactile distraction. I've stuck auditory up there as well because it makes my example that I'm about to run through work, but any sense really can be distracted if we overload it to a certain level. So the human brain is very good at using different modes. For instance, we can listen to a conversation, we can look at something, we can pick things up and process thoughts all at the same time. What we're not so good at is doing two of the same thing. So think about listening to two conversations at the same time. We're not very good at that normally. People say they're good at multitasking, and reality is they probably do two things poorly. So bringing this back to a computer analogy, we can see that a computer might be able to run, say, all of Office programs, a video player, an internet browser, and copy a file using different modes. But if you try and run a fairly graphics-intense computer-aided design package, a video game, and watch a movie, you can understand that it might start running slowly. So if I start illustrating my model here, this is normal driving, so we have mostly visual. This is kind of what we use when we're driving most of the time, and a little bit of mental, cognitive while we're driving. If we then think, then maybe hear a phone ringing while we're driving, it's possible that we might look for it. So we need to add a little bit more to the visual column there. We can see the columns building up. We certainly be listening to it, so we add a bit to auditory. We might think about what the call is about, so we need to stick a bit more on mental. And we might even reach for the phone, so we have another little level of tactile there as well. But are we really distracted? Well, probably not. You know, we're nearing the limits, but we perhaps aren't fully distracted in a kind of academic sense. So, liken this to the computer, we might not be overloaded yet. But if we then consider we might do something about the call, but we decide that ringing back is too much bother, we'll send a text. Now, we know that sending a text uses a lot of visual capacity. So this combines with the already high load that normal driving takes. And this might put us over our computing or attentional resource and could lead to errors occurring. So actually this is where unintended, my example is probably initiated, someone's decided to pick up a phone, but it's very easy to overload a sense without really knowing about it until it's too late. So what does this mean for our attentional capacity, the driving sense? So we need to be a bit clever about how we use vehicles and how we use them as our office or our workspace, or how we do tasks in them or with them. Just adding more stuff to the same mode will likely lead to distraction. So adding more mirrors in my example there, providing a backup video or a video to show backup, when we've already got mirrors to monitor. We're providing information in the same mode, the same format. And how often do people ignore another buzzer going off in a cab? Is it better to provide information? If we need to provide that information, is it better to provide it in another format, like Haptic, for instance, which is a posh word for vibrating seats or steering wheels or any other kind of tactile mode? So again, too many sources of information in the same mode can cause issues. The last concept in terms of kind of how our brains work and how we get distracted I want to introduce is stress and the impact of stress on driving. There are no a major contributor to both attention and distraction is stress. Stress and errors appear to be very closely linked. We can all probably recall times where an error in a task has led to stress, and equally we can probably remember a time when our stress levels led to an error. But is stress really all bad? You know, potentially not all stress is bad, and actually very early psychology work from the turn of the century shows that stress can actually be quite good for us if used correctly. So we can probably consider, think back to what we've done in the past, presenting, performing, taking exams, probably the one that gives us with a lurch in the stomach. We often feel nervous or anxious before these activities. In sport, we can feel apprehensive or excited. All of these feelings can make us perform better up to a point. And this is where I want to introduce very early stuff. Apologies, not exactly groundbreaking, 1908. But this is the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which you probably see. I'll just draw that on. And that's Yerkes up in the top corner. I couldn't find a picture of Dodson, so we'll just have to ignore him for a bit. This shows a relationship between performance, that's any performance, so we'll consider driving performance here, and arousal or stress. Apologies for using the word arousal, but that's the technical term they tend to use. So if we have low arousal, so we're not particularly stimulated or motivated, we might not perform very well. At the other end of the scale, if stress is too high, we might struggle to complete tasks successfully. So in driving, our driving task falls below an acceptable level. So if I start putting some bits on the curve, we can see we want to be driving in here, really. We want to be motivated, stimulated, aroused enough to drive well. Now, most of driving, particularly heavy vehicles and fleets, is probably down here, motorway driving. And that brings in a bit of an issue because actually arousal level, stress level is quite low for providing it's not particularly busy or particularly technical. We end up driving in this sort of low level of stress and low level of performance potentially. At the other end of the scale, and apologies for using a sporting term here, but we find choke. We simply can't perform the task adequately due to the high levels of stress. If you think of the most difficult driving task you're being asked to do. So that's kind of the last bit I want to cover with the kind of concepts really. So a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 10 years has been trying to understand distraction actually out on the real world, looking at real world drivers, mostly car drivers unfortunately, but a few truck drivers. So I want to kind of introduce distraction in terms of numbers. Now I've tried to include real world studies here because there's a lot of simulated stuff, but that can kind of get, is that really realistic of the real world? So I'm going to try and avoid that as much as possible. So information from UK suggests that UK reported crashes, nearly 13% were identified as being due to driver distraction. It's potentially a lot higher because people don't tend to admit it, and there isn't very much physical information about distractions, if we consider what myself and Aidan have been talking about. Of these, 60% were caused by in-vehicle distractions. And in the US, National Highway Safety Administration, or Transport Safety Administration, so NHTSA, estimate that a quarter of all crashes are caused by some form of driver inattention or distraction. And other studies in the US say that could be as high as 50%. So measuring visual distraction is actually very difficult. Cameras appear to be the best way of doing it, as Aidan will probably attest to. Particularly when we're looking at very detailed measures of it, we tend to default back to things like glance duration, glance frequency. So how long drivers look at an object and how often they look at that object. This is purely visual distraction we're talking about now. We're not really talking about the other side of mental things that's even more difficult to measure. So data from studies that I'm about to run through have come up with this kind of rule of thumb. This is a NHTSA guideline, which shows that glances totaling more than 2 seconds for any purpose increase near crash risk by at least 2 times that of normal undistracted driving, or driving that doesn't involve glances 2 seconds. So it's quite a good rule of thumb to work on that one. So one of the first major studies to use this was the 100-car study. Unsurprisingly, used 100 cars fitted with data logging and video capture. As you can see from the values up there, quite a lot of driving miles. Analysis of the video showed that crashes and near misses, or rather 8% of all crashes and near misses were influenced by distraction in some way, and the drivers spent 14.5% of time driving in a distracted condition. So just in that sample, that's nearly 6,000 hours of distracted driving, which is quite scary when you consider how many millions of miles and thousands of hours we have driving every year in this country. This is a study I was involved in, so the Teleflop study. We looked at nomadic devices, which is posh word for things you can carry between vehicles, satellite navigation systems, basically. We used only 100 hours of video data, but we used eye trackers and frame-by-frame video analysis, so watching videos frame by frame, 25 frames a second, so very, very detailed analysis. And we showed that by adding just a simple thing like a navigation device, something that isn't actually, they weren't operating it, they were just looking at it, doubled the eyes off road time. So from a baseline of nearly 7% eyes off road time with normal driving to over 14% in the navigation state. Long glances didn't change, however, so sat-navs aren't particularly distracting in that measure. Next study we worked on, I'm going to run through these quite quickly, but there's a lot of information to cover, but I'm just going to give an overview generally of what sort of some of these more modern devices in vehicles can provide and can impact distraction. So Eurofort, again, EU-funded project looking at intelligent vehicle systems. So things that we now have basically active tech in vehicles and sat-navs and stuff. Both heavy trucks and cars, they had 972 vehicles and just over 1,000 drivers, 35 million kilometers driven, so this is a much bigger study. They showed some distraction results for a range of electronic driver aids. So the one I've highlighted, the top one there, forward collision warning and adaptive cruise control combined together as a single technology, showed that an increase in visual secondary tasks is their fancy word. Basically means people start looking around the vehicle and doing more with their eyes because they feel that their vehicle is looking out for them. Now, potentially these things could prevent crashes, but we need to be sure that we are directing people's eyes in the right way. Lane departure warning systems, they found, so these are not built in, these are aftermarket lane departure warning systems. Added more glances to other nomadic devices in the vehicles, but they were regulated, so people were actually quite good drivers. Unfortunately use more other devices, whereas actually bad drivers didn't. So the drivers who were previously poorly rated didn't continue looking around the vehicle at other things, which is a sort of unexpected result. So this could just be contrived, this could be an artifact of the analysis, but it's quite interesting to see that not all devices in vehicles have the impact you expect. And navigation systems showed that programming, so manual tasks, only happen in low demand situations. So the Yerkes curve, if we think back to that, probably back to motorways. System handling on rural roads and highways rarely occurred. Drivers tended to compensate by using the system's stationary, which is actually quite nice to see, but they're quite a mature system. So that's a really fast skip through kind of projects, a real overview, but I can provide more bits of information if you're particularly interested in one device. So the last thing I want to do is recommendations, and these are purely from not being a fleet operator or anything like that. This is from an academic viewpoint, what we think we can do out there. So the first one, remove distractions. They might sound pretty obvious, but it's still probably the simplest way of dealing with things. I think Aidan ran through quite a lot of those, removing distractions. So again, we would say, what's actually needed to do the job or the task. Generally, less things to think about, touch, listen to, look at, the better the driving should be. But we need to keep in mind that Yerkes curve. If we reduce the stimulation to a level that means driver performance is impacted, we may run into other unintended consequences. As we've seen, distractions are not always obvious, hence what I was trying to say before about building up a number of different elements. They might not even be physical, such as a phone or a tablet or anything like that. An annoying dashboard rattle or something. If you've been listening to that for a couple of 100 miles, you might be tempted to try and fix it while you're driving. And I think Aidan touched on some of those things, like fixing things in cabs, sorting out the clutter, is really useful because they nag on drivers' minds and they get to you after a while, and you will find yourself unintentionally distracted. So next one we would say is provide feedback in different modes. Just because something has always been text or paper-based, is it the best way to continue? If you've got a lot of other visual things in the cab, is it better to provide something as an audio message or a vibration? I don't know. Any way you can do to change those modes around and provide it in a different way should reduce the overall workload. Use training to profile drivers, perhaps, and determine this Yerkes-Dodson point. So what we want to do is try and get all drivers into that optimal driving performance. So it might be useful to understand how each job and task relate to that curve. If you have a lot of distraction crashes on motorways, is there a way to raise driver arousal? So provide training on commentary driving, for example, which is shown to raise people's alertness while they're driving. Equally, crashes while reversing or manoeuvring. Are the amount of mirrors, cameras, bings, bongs, whatever you have, overloading drivers? Are they then at the other end, at the choke point of the curve? And can they be removed or shifted to another mode, for instance? And people always go on about this one, company culture, but it does have an effect. Obviously, we really, being road safety people, we don't really want to have crashes with their members of staff, so we have a very strict phone off and in boot policy. That might not work for everybody, but it's something to do. Competition elements can work. We have done other trials and shown that competition elements work. So driver behaviour models and things that rank drivers, and they have a reason to perform better. And finally, review systems and operating procedures or processes. So what do people have in cabs? What do people have in their normal working or their normal driving task? Do those systems cause long or repeated glances? Think back to the NHTSA guidelines. Do they increase driver workload to an acceptable level? The EU has, and will probably, I don't know whether we're going to be using this soon, but voluntary regulation on HMI sort of navigation, if you will. So how easy is human-machine interface? So your all the stuff that your car does, your radio and your temperature and all that kind of stuff. How quickly can you navigate around that? And that's based on that 2-second rule. So you need to be able to operate a number of menu systems very quickly without too much distraction. So find out whether systems in place are exceeding those or not, because it is a regulation for a reason. It is based on scientific fact. And that may involve running small trials or benchmarking products just to work out whether the one you intend to use is going to give you the best result. So that's me for now, and that is me. So thank you very much. If you have any questions or comments, but if not, you can always contact me on that at another point. I'll leave that up for now.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. We haven't had any questions in yet, so we'll just pass on to Nobby for now.
Okay. No worries.
That's great. Thank you.
Just clicking on my screen, hopefully.
That's great. Thank you.
Anything yet? Not coming up.
I think you just need to click onto the presentation at the bottom there, and then we should be able to see it.
Presentation at the bottom. Oh yeah, that would help, wouldn't it?
That was great, thank you.
How's that? Yep.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will apologise in advance. My phone has dropped out a couple of times. If that does happen, just bear with me, and I'll ring back as quick as I can. Right, I'm Nobby Clark. I'm the Driver Development Manager, and we have our own Driver Risk Management Department within Balfour Beatty. Balfour Beatty is an extremely large organisation, employing some 35,000 people across the UK. We are just a small cog in the big empire. We are plant and fleet, does what it says on the tin. We provide all the vehicles and plant to do their core job, which is obviously construction. Our role, pretty obvious really what our role is to try and look after the drivers that use our 10,000 vehicles. Just a very brief part about driver risk management. We were put together 9 years ago, or I started the department, and it's just basically gone from strength to strength. The original concept was to look after our own. With 35,000, that's quite a lot of work. That then developed to other companies asking us for assistance. I know Aidan mentioned, for example, Ocado earlier. That's a good example. I do legal compliance courses for Ocado. I do apprentice courses for Rolls-Royce, and the list is endless. So it was good for us in so much, if you like, sharing best practice. People liked what we did, and as a result of making all the contacts, I now go all around the country talking to various companies. With relation to Brake, my connection with Brake goes back for at least 20 years. I've worked in road safety for 30 years, and my personal background, which hopefully you can see on the screen now, I've always been a copper. So I spent 13 years in the RAF Police, and then I spent 22 years in Cheshire Police. If you like, that screen just briefly shows my CV. Probably the nearest and dearest to me there is Family Liaison Officer. Most people know what they do. So I had 17 years experience of walking up that path and knocking on the door. So what was interesting for me, Aidan was talking about the equipment side of road safety, if you like. Steve was talking about the academic side. It all fits in very nicely, actually, because what I'd like to talk about is really what we did on the ground, so to speak, or what we are doing, and to give you some idea of the successes we've had. There's obviously many arguments about what is the right way to conduct road safety. Is it on-road training? Is it skid car courses? Is it workshops? My personal view is it's a bit of everything, actually. It is most definitely about education. Now, that education side could be within a classroom. It can be on the road. It can be in a skid car, for example. And we do all sorts of things. My side of the department is I deal with all the workshops. So obviously with my background, and I use my FLO experience to great use. So out of something that's extremely sad, some good can come. There's no doubt about that, because I explain to people on the workshops what it is like to do that, the effect it has on families, which obviously Brake know all about, which is my obvious main connection with Brake in the world of FLOs in the past. And I can pass that on to people, and it does seem to make them think. That there is no doubt about that when you explain what could be the result of, shall we say, bad driving, and that applies to all of us. Obviously, no one's exempt. One thing I learned very quickly as a traffic policeman is there is no such thing as the best driver in the world, and that includes myself, irrespective of your background. Even driving instructors make mistakes whilst driving, and the reason is nothing to do with the fact they're driving instructors. It's to do with the fact they're human beings. And sometimes I think people sometimes forget that human beings naturally do make mistakes. And in my last job, obviously, sadly, I dealt with people who made mistakes that were fatal. And my job here and now at Balfour Beatty since 2008 when we started, is to try and use that experience to try and get people basically just to think about what they're doing. So obviously we're focusing on driver distraction. Now I'm just briefly showing you some of the sort of slides I would show on the workshops. And obviously the workshops are some 3.5 hours, so this is very, very brief. When I put up that picture example, people have a chuckle. And for example, top left, you know, people shaving whilst driving. Yeah, in 22 years, I personally prosecuted about 20 drivers for shaving whilst driving. I do hasten to add, by the way, they were all male, which is good news, I suppose. Top right, I lost count how many women I prosecuted for, I think, yeah, Aidan mentioned personal grooming. Take my word for it, personal grooming is a huge problem on our roads. As I was saying, I lost count how many women I personally stopped. I mean, I was obviously one at the time of 160 traffic policemen in Cheshire. I lost count personally how many women I stopped for applying makeup whilst driving. Bottom left, you see that quite a lot now. There is no doubt in my mind that's a distraction. Is it illegal? No, it isn't. Listening to music with earphones in your ears, but it's most definitely a distraction. And obviously the good old mobile phone, which for me is the #1 distraction. There's of course other distractions, and again there's briefly some examples. I've got personal experience of prosecuting drivers in the police for all of those and more. For example, bottom right, we used to have a bit of a problem with farmers, for example, driving around in Land Rovers with their Jack Russell jumping around on their lap whilst driving 40, 50 miles an hour down a country lane, which obviously then becomes, there is no offence having a Jack Russell on your lap whilst driving, but certainly it then becomes either dangerous driving or driving without due care and attention. Now, again, Steve is far more qualified than myself when we talk about the types of distraction from an academic point of view. But as I say, I'm just trying to show you the basics that we go through with the people that attend our workshops. And by the way, I think it's very important to emphasise who those people are. Those people range from, if you like, the receptionist up to the managing director. When we started, the attitude surprised me a bit in so much as people thought that all our courses and initiatives were for people who drive company cars. So I nipped that in the bud straight away, because it doesn't matter who owns the vehicle, any vehicle can kill us. So whether Balfour Beatty owned the vehicle or the individual owns the vehicle, I'm actually not really interested. What I'm interested in is keeping the people within that vehicle safe. As I say, whoever owns it is actually irrelevant. And again, preaching to the converted, certainly with the experts like Steve, but we just go through the basics with them, and we cover the main 3 types of distraction. Visual, which I think is pretty obvious what that is, anything that takes our eyes off the road. Then we talk about manual, that's anything that takes our hands off the steering wheel. And just in case you're wondering why I put manual or mechanical, the Americans, bless them, have to be different, and they actually call it mechanical, but it is the same thing as manual. And then of course you have the lesser known of the 3, if you like, the cognitive type of distraction, and that's anything that takes our mind off driving. Now, there is only one that comes immediately to mind that involves all 3. And we are at a stage now, my son's a police officer, I obviously keep in contact with my ex-colleagues in the traffic police, and the rule of thumb nowadays tends to be when traffic police do catch people texting, they tend to try and take them to court. And never mind this 3 points and a couple of £100 fine, because texting goes way beyond 3 points and a couple of £100 fine. That's going into the realms of dangerous driving. Now, those 3 elements I mentioned are involved with this without a doubt. So there's the visual distraction. You're certainly doing something where you have to look away from the road if you choose to text whilst driving. You are definitely doing something that involves taking your hands off the steering wheel. It'd be very difficult not to text without taking your hand off the steering wheel. And then, of course, cognitive. Whether we like it or not, you are definitely thinking about something else. And that's, as others have mentioned, the main task in hand, and that's driving. And that's where the cognitive side comes in. Now, this bit I've always found very strange, and having spent a lifetime in the forces and in the public sector, and I still am amazed by what I call the culture within some companies of mobile phones. And I'd just like to share some of the excuses, if you like, I've been given by people in various companies, no names, no pack drill, that have given me their excuse for having to use a mobile phone, for example, whilst driving. So none of these are made up. I have to contact the office on a regular basis as I have to check in and see what jobs need doing. So my response to that excuse is, so why can't you pull it into the lay-by and make that call? I'm on call. Oh, this is a regular one, this. I'm on call, so I have to take any phone calls that come in. Yes, I appreciate you're on call, but once again, I'm sure it's quite easy to just find a safe place to stop. The services, if you're on the motorway, obviously, lay-bys, etc., and then call in. Now, I have to try and keep this one short, but I did have a major fallout a few years ago with a managing director, and no matter what I suggested to this person, he had to use a phone whilst driving. And that's basically what he said to me. I'm a managing director. I have to be in contact 24/7, as I could be making decisions that decide whether we are awarded multi-million-pound contracts or not. So, managing director or not, I subtly advised him, I don't like that as an excuse at all. Even you can still stop at a lay-by or the services. I have to answer all calls whether I'm driving or not. No one's that important is my answer to that one. But what I would say, and I'd say to all of them, right up to senior management, I just ask them, could you just ask yourself, is our multi-million-pound company going to immediately collapse because you did not answer or make that call immediately? No one's actually been able to answer me that question, but I know what the answer to that is. No, it's not. It's as simple as that. And what we're trying to educate people to do, certainly in our company and other companies I work with, is your business is not going to collapse if you don't answer that phone call immediately. All right, 5-10 minutes later, you find somewhere to stop, and then you call up. And if your business did collapse because of it, then I would suggest that your time management is not very good at all. So the question that's been put to us is, what have we done about this as a business? Very, very difficult. As you can see, we are quite a large organisation, and these are just some the individual Balfour Beatty organisations that are out there that obviously combine together make Balfour Beatty per se, if you like. So yes, what we do is it took us 5 years to convince the business that we must have a complete ban on phones. But the $1 million question for me is the one at the bottom: is the ban policed? You want an honest answer? Anyone that knows me will always get an honest answer from me. No, it isn't. It's as simple as that. You can have as many policies as you want. A lot of policies are put in place, certainly in my experience in the police, a lot of policies are put in place to tick a box. Oh, we must do that, so we'll have a policy for that. And that's it, and it's filed away and left there. That's not good enough. It's fair enough to have a policy, but the policy must be policed. Now, if you said to me, how do you do that? Well, that's the $1 million question as well. It's down to the individual companies to police it correctly. And you must have whatever your process is going to be. I'm not for 1 minute implying that the second someone uses a phone whilst driving, sack them. That's not my intention at all. But there must be something definitive that's publicised correctly to drivers and all staff as to the consequences if they insist on using a mobile phone whilst driving. There's sort of many forms of distraction, and the list goes on and on and on and on. That's the basic definition of distraction I've found, which others have mentioned as well. I mean, we've spoken about mobile phones as a distraction. Someone mentioned the telematics side. That is definitely a distraction. Some telematic systems are on view to the driver. I've never really understood why that is. I don't understand why that system cannot be hidden away. Yes, the drivers know the equipment's there, but why they've actually got to see it, no one's been able to explain that one to me. And certainly at ground level, if you like, carrying out the workshops, it is one of the biggest complaints from our drivers that the telematics, they've accepted the telematics, they've got no problem with it. But many of them remind me that the actual equipment is distracting them from driving, and I agree with them 100%. Then, of course, you've got speeding, which, again, Aidan mentioned earlier. Speeding in itself is a distraction. There's no doubt about that. I would argue, there's always a lot of arguments about sat-navs. I personally think it's a very good road safety device, a sat-nav, but, and there's a very big but, that's if it's used correctly. For example, I regularly see in my travels, and I'm sure others have seen it, where you'll see a vehicle hurtle past you on the motorway and you'll see the driver leaning over playing with the tom-tom on the dashboard, but he's doing 80 miles an hour at the time. Well, I would argue that's not the correct way of using a sat-nav. So obviously, using it that way, it does become a distraction. But and again, it's very much a personal opinion. If that device is used correctly and safely, I would argue that it's not so much of a distraction, shall we say. Now, as I say, the list of distraction is endless. I sat down and I came up with a few. Certainly weather, particularly this glorious weather we're having at the moment, that most definitely is a distraction. Certainly around my area in Cheshire where I live, we've had trees coming down and all sorts. So that is most definitely a distraction. Other traffic on the road. The best advice I was ever given by a police driving instructor was drive like everyone else on the road. Everyone else on the road is going to do the opposite of what you expect them to do. Now, if you think about it, that's extremely good advice. So when I drive, if there's a car in the junction as I'm approaching, as far as I'm concerned, that car is going to come out in front of me. If there's a child standing on a road, on the pavement, that child is going to run out in front of me, etc., etc. Now, if I could give anyone any good piece of advice from experienced police driving instructors, that's the one piece of advice I would give you, because you're psychologically you're thinking about it, and I think if Steve mentioned commentary drives, brilliant commentary drives, absolutely fantastic, because when you do commentary drives, psychologically you're looking for something to talk about, so you notice more, and I would advise people to try it. Maybe not try it when you've got someone in the car, because they might think there's something wrong with it, but certainly when you're in the car on your own, talk out loud about what you see, and I can guarantee you will see more hazards than if you don't talk about it. Passengers, an obvious distraction. So when I'm driving down the road and my wife is advising me, and distracting me, is it practical for me to stop the vehicle, ask her to leave the vehicle, and carry on? By that way, I've got rid of the distraction. But in all seriousness, of course, it's not. I do believe, and again, very much might be controversial, but I don't think you can eliminate distraction. I think it's impossible. What you can do, though, is you can control distraction. Mobile phones are a classic, and the way you control mobile phone distraction is you don't answer it when it rings. So what you've actually done, you've eliminated that distraction, but whilst you've got rid of that one, there are other distractions, obviously. Road traffic collisions, what a classic distraction. Rubbernecking, I'm sure you're all familiar with that expression. Certainly when we had crashes on the M6 in my time in Cheshire, we always, without fail, had a crash on the other carriageway. And that's down to people having a look, which always baffled me because I don't understand what there is to look at. You know, there's a couple of cars that are bent or whatever, and yet it's one of those things that a lot of people look at. Potholes, oh, how very controversial. That is a distraction within itself. I'll say no more than that. In-car entertainment, radio, CD, etc. Looking at the scenery. You might be driving around in a very nice part of the UK. We are all human. You know, you might look away and think, oh, look at that over there. Now, the last one always tends to get a bit of a giggle, but it's very, very true. I thought, how can I put this? Naturally gifted, good-looking people. I can speak from experience. I don't mean personally. I mean, well, as a traffic policeman, I went to a crash a number of years ago where I did laugh, I must admit, but luckily no one was hurt. It's just a bent metal, where I obviously asked the first question, what happened here? And the driver said, you're not going to believe me, officer. And I said, I will. I've heard it all. He said, I was driving down the road and a very good-looking 6-foot tall blonde was walking up the road, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. And he drove straight into the back of the vehicle in front that just happened to be stationary. So again, if we're honest in our lifetime, I think it goes on both sides. You know, we might look at, as it says there, naturally gifted, good-looking people whilst driving, but that in itself is a distraction. So what do we do about all this? What's our sort of game plan? I'm a great believer in you start at the top and then you work down, not the other way around. So what I do is I go and meet with senior management. So, for example, a very quick example, Balfour Beatty Rail, number of years ago, massive problem with various things. So I met with their MD, financial director, round the boardroom, and basically had a chat, what we suggested you consider doing, etc., etc. What they then did, thankfully, they took it all on board. They filtered that information through their particular company structure, obviously down the chain. And then they put out, when it got down to, if you like, line manager, they then put out the information on what we're going to do, what the initiatives are, what the courses are, and then we put the courses in place. But what was a very important thing to do, if anyone goes down this line, you must evaluate those courses as you go. Road safety is never a tick-the-box option. It's an ongoing process. With road safety, I think everyone who works in road safety will agree with this. You can't just walk into a company, deliver a program, and that's the end of it. Right, we've done that. No, you have to keep revisiting it. Very much important in road safety. Then, obviously, once you've got the evaluation, which we do constantly, we analyse it and we act upon the information that data tells us. And then, very, very importantly, we look at the next stages, what we're going to do next. Because as I've already said, you don't complete a program and that's it, you forget all about it. You then look at something else. So I thought very, very briefly, just before I wrap up, is just to show you very briefly how we've progressed so far. What we did in Balfour Beatty Rail, they had a huge speeding problem. So what we did was I developed our own speed awareness course. We put that in place. We monitored it over 2 years, and with Balfour Beatty Rail saw a 75% drop in speeding. Now, obviously, the data comes from the telematics within the vehicles. I've worked with a few companies, they record data on telematics, but do absolutely nothing with it. And that is the worst thing you can do, because actually it can hang you, for want of a better expression, if you have a major incident and the traffic police are involved, because you've now got data that they can use against you. So if your data is showing a speed problem, if it isn't, well, that's okay. But if it is, you've got to do something about it. And that's what we did. And when I started the course, I was asked, what do I feel would be the sort of drop to expect? And I said a 25% drop, and I'd be happy. Obviously, I was bowled over when it was actually 75% drop. The benefits of that, obviously, you save a lot of money on fuel. They've saved a lot of money on their tyres, because obviously when people slow down, the tyre life is extended. You reduce collisions. The knock-on effects are many. Then the next stage, we looked at a very big subject. We have had a few crashes where drivers have basically fallen asleep. So we've done a lot of research into this. So we have driver welfare, health and fatigue courses. We look at not just fatigue, eyesight, ergonomics, how we sit in vehicles, better advice, how we can adjust the headrest in the vehicle, and many, many things within that course. And then the third and final one, there's others, but obviously for time reasons, I'm trying to keep this short. This is a bit of my bugbear, really. One of the things we're finding is a lot of line managers actually don't know the legislation themselves. So what we've developed is a driver legislation and compliance course for managers. And as I said earlier, this is the course that I deliver, amongst other companies, to Ocado, their supervisors. And on that note, I hope that was okay for you and you found that useful. And hopefully there may be some questions. So I'll end it there.
That's great. Thank you, Nobby. So in terms of education, you mentioned that a lot of your complaints come from people like managing directors who say they have to be accessible at all times. But how about the drivers themselves? You know, if you're just a driver in a normal fleet, often they claim there's a pressure from above, so they have to be able to answer their phone to see which location they're going to next, or just available for calls at all times. So if it is the fact that all the pressure is coming from the top, how do you think it's best to kind of tackle that? Because obviously until somebody on the board makes that decision to change their behaviour, we're not going to see any difference in the drivers themselves unless the managing directors are the ones who are buying into it as well.
That is a really good question, and I wish I had the exact answer to that. I would suggest that the issue is not at managing director level, to answer the question you posed me. What we're finding is it tends to be at line manager stroke supervisor level. What I mean by that is, for example, one of the things I found out I had to put out through the health and safety side in Balfour Beatty was there was not a lot of realisation, in fact there was no realisation, that even if you use a hands-free device whilst driving and you have an incident, you can still be prosecuted. And a lot of people believe that, well, how can I be prosecuted when I'm actually doing something that is legal? And I had to explain to various managers or management that you most certainly can be prosecuted. All they've got to prove in a court of law is that you were distracted by that call. Whether that call is hands-free or handheld is actually, in a court of law, irrelevant. And they didn't know that. So I said, well, if any company has got a you can't use hands-free policy, it's actually a bit of a ridiculous policy because their drivers still can be prosecuted. So they took that on board as part of them actually implementing the ban where no one can use phones now whilst driving. Obviously, if I'm totally honest, I'm not that naive to believe that everyone stopped using them, because there will be people that use them. How you actually control that, well, you can't unless you're sat in the vehicle with them, obviously. What you can do is your best with the management.
Okay, and we've had a couple of requests just to find out more about the training you give yourself, and whether you're okay with people contacting you about that. Is that something you're open to?
Very much so, open to it. As I say, I should have put my contact details on there. But,
no, that's okay. We'll send those around.
Yeah, by all means. Well, as I said, what I tend to do, I'm more than happy to come and meet with anyone, anywhere. There's no charge for this, by the way. This isn't sales pitch. I'm an ex-policeman. I'm not a salesman. What this is, what I tend to do is, I many times, I just pitch up at someone's offices, do a quick presentation, have a chat over a cup of coffee, and obviously being an ex-policeman, the chocolate biscuit won't go amiss. And that's it. And then they make their decision themselves as to whether they want to work with us. So I'm more than happy for people to contact me, and I can do that.
Well, that's great. Thank you. So in terms of this webinar, copies of the presentations and a recording will be available online shortly, so we'll send that across to all delegates, and a short feedback form as well. Thank you to all of our speakers today, and just a reminder that we have another webinar coming up on Tuesday the 4th of July on the development of low emission vehicles and their place in your fleet. So to register, or if you have any questions, just drop us an email on professional@brake.org.uk. Thank you.